ran a trial of psilocybin in people that had treatment-resistant depression. The way that it was dosed is that the people got a single dose of psilocybin. So not microdosing, not 3 big trips, not 5 big trips. They got a single dose of psilocybin, 25 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin. And before they got the first dose, they took this MADRS test. And then they got the single dose. And then 6 weeks later, they took the MADRS test again.
Right.
Okay, so that is how they measured the improvement or theoretical improvement in depression
score.
In depression as measured by the MADRS score. Now, they had 256 or 258, something along, 258 people in total in this trial. Half of them had psilocybin, half of them had a placebo. And then what they did is they calculated what is the average difference in the before that psilocybin dose and the 6-week post-dose measurement for the placebo group and for the active group, and then look at the difference between those two averages. And so you find like, what is the difference between the average change in the placebo group versus the people that actually got the psilocybin? And the difference was 3.6 points. That was kind of like the difference between the averages of those groups. And as we're going to talk about, we're going to put that into context, because unless you know what the reference is, 3.6 could be huge, it could be nothing. Spoiler, I guess, is that it's kind of in the middle.
Right.
But that's just what I wanted to make sure people understood. And the other thing I want people to understand before we get into the analysis is that this is a interim readout. This is not the final result of the trial. This is, companies will often do these interim readouts as sort of a preview. Oftentimes these are done before the trial is even finished. We're not sure what Compass will ultimately release. They will probably release a lot of other data. This is a single data point that they decided to release as sort of a sneak peek of what is coming next.
Yes. And maybe 2 other points before we get into the analysis again. I think it's important for listeners to know that, generally speaking, with these larger clinical trials that are more meaningful and closer to the end of the drug development road, more sites, meaning the more clinical trial sites that are used to administer the drug and the placebo in this clinical trial design, the better, because there is variation, and more sites generally correlates with, I would say, more like even sampling. I think it's common sense. So
they had 32 different sites in this study, which is good.
It's pretty good.
It's a good amount. And so just to be clear, the only thing that this trial tells us is what the difference in response between the placebo and active groups were at the 6-week mark based on the dose of psilocybin that they gave them. They didn't do multiple different doses to experiment. They had 25 milligrams. That's what everyone in the active group got. So this doesn't tell us anything about how useful psilocybin at lower doses or higher doses is. It doesn't tell us anything about how effective psilocybin is 1 week after dosing or 1 year after dosing. It is literally just how effective is psilocybin at this dose between day 0 and week 6. That's the only thing you can infer from this data.
Yeah. And, both of us did our research separately and are coming together right now. Like, I wanted to ask you if you had seen, I saw musings of the executive team saying that they're purposefully not even looking at any of like the secondary or tertiary endpoints or data themselves. I guess obviously to not bias any coverage or any like public announcements, but like, did you see anything specific about maybe more detail into the reason around why they're doing that, other than just not trying to preemptively state something that might not actually be true?
I think it's probably just to make sure that they are, that no one could accuse them of any improprieties.
Okay.
That would be my guess.
All right. So
do you want to comment on anything having to do with the data here?
I do, but I was going to ask if you could put like the steps into context around what happened with the stock, because there was some movement and there was some reporting that happened. Some equity research analysts put out some reports before. So
yeah, I'm down to talk about the stock, but I think before we do that, I think we should talk about how this outcome compares with other clinical trials of other depression treatments, whether they're psychedelic depression treatments or, SSRIs or something. And then we can talk about the stock.
Yeah, I have my notes here. I mean, so generally speaking, I think we could talk about the stock and the analysis after. I'm just trying to separate my thoughts here. But so COMP360, which is this drug that is in question right now, the delta, let's call it the delta, was 3.6.
Between the placebo and active.
Between the placebo and active group. And I took a look at all placebo-controlled trials that have been conducted in treatment-resistant depression, and the results are honestly like really mixed. I think that what's been interesting to see is that, of course, GH Research, their 5-MeO-DMT drug, they had, I believe, a delta of something like 9. Was it something significant like that?
I'll tell you in a second. Much bigger, actually.
You're bringing it up. Let's see. Hold on.
So while Sam's pulling that up, let me just put Compass's 3.6 delta into context. So when you look at traditional antidepressants, Zoloft, which is the most commonly prescribed antidepressant in the United States, there have been a number of different trials, and meta-analysis suggests that there's a delta between the placebo and active about 4.1. After a number of weeks. Now, of course, this requires daily dosing and you get all the side effects associated with SSRIs. Lexapro, probably the third or second most commonly prescribed SSRI or antidepressant. Meta-analyses of its effectiveness show a 3.6 delta, which is actually the exact same delta between placebo and active that Compass had.
This is in TRD? Treatment-resistant depression?
In TRD,
okay.
Yes, in a specific one. Now, the Zoloft is an MDD, and it's tough to find data around TRD because a lot of these drugs have been trialed more for MDD than TRD. MDD meaning major depressive disorder, the most common type of depression diagnosis, TRD meaning treatment-resistant depression. The point is that probably part of the reason why this stock crashed is that Compass's 3.6 delta is not significantly different than what you see from kind of garden variety antidepressants that have been around for a long time. And I think that given all of the discourse around how amazing psychedelics are at treating depression, people were expecting a 10-point difference, maybe even a 20-point difference. And when it turns out that, yes, the Compass product works, but it gives you efficacy along the lines of what you can already get with Zoloft or Lexapro or Prozac, maybe it's not as exciting of a story. Now, I think, can I keep going for a sec?
Yeah, but okay, go ahead.
I think that the people that are kind of hating on Compass for this sort of lukewarm result are failing to account for the fact that these Compass results were achieved with a single dose of a drug, not a daily pill. And that this is sort of the first significant large end trial of a psychedelic drug, whereas these SSRIs have been trialed in different forms for a very long time, and we know how the dosing should be optimized, et cetera. There's very little optimization that has been done on the dosing protocol, the actual therapeutic protocol, the trip protocol, if you want to call it that, of the Compass drug. And I would suspect that as time goes on and we figure out how to use this product more effectively, you're going to see much bigger MADRS differences. The other thing that I would say, and I know you're chomping at the bit, and that's fine if you. So we have to also contrast Compass's results with the results of the two other major psychedelic drugs, one of which, yes.
I was just going to say, like, before we get there, you started talking about some like delta and MADRS score between placebo and patient arms in like major depressive disorder trials, which, you know, we can do for the sake of like the generalist biotech investor who's probably making those analyses. But I want to actually specifically cite some of the deltas for drugs that have actually been trialed for treatment-resistant depression.
All right, tell me.
So I brought it up, but you were going to say something about looking at some of the other psychedelic drugs.
We'll do that later. Let's. What data did you find about the differences for drugs that have been approved for TRD?
Yeah. So brexpiprazole, basically brexpiprazole was a drug that was looked at as an adjunct. So an adjunct is like an additive add-on therapy for people that are already taking a baseline SSRI like Lexapro. And the delta there was modest, and it was negative 2.15, but it was consistent and accepted for add-on benefit. And so I believe the Compass Pathways team had put out this statement before the results read out saying that they were hoping for something that was 3 or higher. So just put that into context.
It was 2.5, 2.15.
2.15. And if you look at IV ketamine, so ketamine is the active pharmaceutical ingredient that's in Spravato, but Spravato is used in a nasal spray. If you look at IV ketamine, which is directly administered into the bloodstream, the delta was 7.95, which is robust. It's a rapid effect, but it's short-lived.
At how many days?
That's actually the primary endpoint, I think, for that was read out at 24 hours.
So we're talking the difference between a day later versus 6 weeks later.
Right. And so this brings into the question of something called durability, which, psilocybin has been thought to have like very durable effects. Ketamine and other types of drugs like it are very short-lived, and they clear out much more quickly. To put that into even more context, S-ketamine, which is a form of ketamine, actually on day 28, the differential was 4. So, and this actually led to FDA approval. So I believe the sponsor for this, this was a J&J sponsored trial. So it's underperforming relatively compared to standard of care that looks great, which is ketamine, and obviously Spravato is on track to become a blockbuster. But I think the analysis is more nuanced around a few other compounding factors that might not necessarily just be this score itself. But I'll pause, and you were going to say something about comparing this to other psychedelics as well. So
yeah, so the one recent clinical trial readout that happened that had a lot of people talking was GH Research, which is a publicly traded company. They released a readout from their trial of 5-MeO-DMT for treatment-resistant depression. And they had a lot of attention in the press because their MADRS delta was 15.5, which is wild. None of the drugs that we've talked about on this podcast so far, not even ketamine, have anything close to 15.5.
And what was the time point?
Now, this is on day 8. So somewhere, not 24 hours, but also not 6 weeks either. But I think now there are some caveats here. They only had 80 patients in their entire trial, whereas Compass had 258. And I think that if there's like a meta point that can be made about what we just talked about over the last 10 minutes, it's that it's a lot more difficult than one might think to really determine how useful these drugs are relative to others, because there is no standard way to measure or report them. As much as people might want to think that the FDA has like a very established, consistent process that must be applied, that's actually not really true. Like, yes, they accept the MADRS score, but there's no rule that says every single drug has to be trialed in such a way where we measure it at day 0 and at day 60. As you can see, some of these trials measure at day 8, some of them measure at day 60, some of them measure 24 hours after, and they all come up with their own arguments as to like why this is the right way to measure it. And so it's very hard to just look at the headline number and say, oh, well, 3.6 is lower than Zoloft at 4.1, so therefore this is like less effective. It's just not that simple. Mm-hmm. And then you have to take into account the frequency of the therapy. Is it a single time, like Compass? Is it once a week, like esketamine? Is it every single day, like Lexapro? Mm-hmm. There is no easy way to analyze these things on a relative basis. And I think that in typical market fashion, there was a lot of attention put on this single number, this 3.6 differential. And there was some real quick kind of like, well, I see other numbers that are bigger, so this must not be good. And people just decided to sell.